Good morning, and thank you all for joining us for this webinar. My name is Stacey. I work with the goFLUENT marketing team, and I'm delighted to be with you this morning. Welcome everyone. If at any time during this webinar you experience technical problems, you can let us know by sending us a chat or clicking the Raise Your Hand button, which you will see on the right-hand side of your screen. You may also have noticed that your microphone is muted, but you may also ask your questions through the chat window on the right-hand side of the screen. Before we begin, I would just like to say a few words about goFLUENT and introduce our webinar facilitator, Amy Wood. With over a decade worth of experience, goFLUENT specializes in on-demand business English training, combining e-learning, written coaching, and live training by telephone. goFLUENT is recognized as a leader in the field of distance learning and has won some of the top awards in the industry. We work with 60% of the top 20 companies in the world, with offices in 10 countries, and provide training to clients across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. At goFLUENT, we believe in blended learning and offer one of the most integrated e-learning platforms in the industry, with content from our partners at AFP, the New York Times, and Harvard Business Review. We are happy to have Amy with us today. Amy is the North American Manager for Training and Performance Standards at goFLUENT. She is a member of the American Society for Training and Development and has close to a decade of experience in evaluating the English language levels of EFL learners in various fields of business. Amy has personally evaluated the English levels of thousands of EFL and ESL learners. In addition, she has helped hundreds of learners prepare for standardized English tests. In her current role as a training manager, Amy understands the importance of choosing the right test or measurement tool. Inaccurate measurement of English skills can lead to expensive mistakes and lasting harm to businesses. Amy will share her knowledge and experience to help you save time and money by choosing the right test for your English evaluation needs. Thank you, Amy, for being with us today, and without further ado, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Stacey, and thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar today. I'd like to begin by taking you through the agenda that we'll cover in this meeting today. We'll be talking about why proficiency frameworks are relevant to you in the corporate setting, and I'll be describing, of course, exactly what a proficiency framework is. We'll also talk about what English tests aim to measure, and we'll discuss which standardized tests might meet your specific corporate needs. And we'll also spend some time talking about the effects of testing on recruitment, career development, and evaluation. But before we get into all of those interesting points, I'd like to know a little bit more about you, our audience. So I'm going to share a polling question with you. You'll see the question appear on your screen, and when it does, please select the answer that best describes why you're interested in today's topic. This will help me to better understand who our audience is today so that I can tailor my message to what means the most to you. So once you've chosen your answer, click the Submit button, and in just a moment, I'll share the results with everyone. All right, I see lots of responses coming in. Thank you, everyone, for your answers. I'm going to close the poll now and share those results with you. So you can see that the majority of our audience today is here because they're curious about standardized testing. The second largest group are those of you who actually use testing to assess job candidates. And then the smallest portion of our attendees today are here because they teach learners and they're helping those learners prepare for standardized tests. So I hope that I can give information to each of you from each of these groups that will be useful and interesting to you in your everyday work, and I'll keep this makeup in mind as I give my comments today. So thank you for taking the time to share that with me. So let's talk more about why we test for English skills. Before we talk about choosing the right test, I think it's important to take a step back and talk about exactly why we test in English, especially focusing on the business setting. So there might be several reasons in the corporate environment that you would test. One of those might be for recruitment. You might want to make sure that you have the right candidate and you're filling a position. Another reason might be for career development, maybe within your talent management program or within your workforce and succession planning. You need to do some English language testing. Another reason you might test would be to do training needs analysis. This would help you analyze any skill gaps. Maybe if you were going to give English training to your employees, you would want to analyze before the training where their skill gaps are, what skills they need to improve, so you know what your goals are for that training. Or if you're giving them other business training, you might be delivering that training in English, so you would need to do your needs analysis in English as well before the training. Conversely, after the training, you might be doing some training effectiveness evaluation to see how effective your training was, to measure the progress over the training period. And again, this could be English language training, or it could be other business skill training that's conducted in English. There may be other reasons that you test as well, but these are some of the most common reasons that I've encountered in my experience. The important thing to understand in the modern world is that globalization is having a dramatic impact on how we do business. Some people might say that the world is shrinking due to globalization, but I prefer to think of it as business opportunities are expanding because of globalization, and English equals opportunity. English is the international language of problem solving. I'd like to ask you another quick poll question. This one has to do with the prevalence of English and your perception of that prevalence. What percentage of the world's data do you think that we've stored electronically in the English language? So out of all the data we've stored electronically, how much of that is stored in English? You can click on your answer and click the Submit button. I'll wait just a moment more so that everyone can enter their responses. Lots of responses coming in. Thank you very much for your participation. All right. I'm going to close the poll now and we'll all look at the results together. So the vast majority of you believe that 80% of the world's data stored electronically is stored in English, and you're right. 80% of all of the information we store electronically is stored in English. And that's a really significant thing if you're thinking about doing business in a global way in the world today. Do you know that today more than 2 billion people around the world are learning English? That's almost a third of the population of the entire planet. So clearly, effective international business communication is very dependent on English. We need good English skills to be effective international communicators. And what are the potential costs to our businesses if we're not effective? Some of the potential costs could be lost sales or revenue, business downtime, very poor procurement, even injuries in your workforce and legal action. So clearly, with so much at stake, businesses need a reliable way to test English communication. And that's where standardized tests come in. Standardized tests give you measurable results across institutions, across geographical boundaries. They're reliable and consistent anywhere in the world. So for example, if you have a test taker with results in Asia, those test results can be comparable to other test takers in South America or Europe or Africa. What that means practically is that if you have an employee who takes a test in China and achieves a certain level of proficiency, you know that that particular employee can communicate effectively at that level of proficiency with other employees in Brazil or Italy or Egypt. You're transcending global boundaries and you're transcending industrial boundaries. So standardized testing ensures that proficiency measurement has no geographical boundary, and that's why it's so important to us in the modern business world. Before we move on and talk about which test to choose, I think it's also good to define exactly what is proficiency, because if we're going to measure something, we certainly need to understand very well what we propose to measure. So the most basic definition of proficiency would be that it is competence and skill and expertise. But we can go one step further, and we can divide proficiency when it comes to language into two kinds. There's technically oriented proficiency and action-oriented proficiency. So let's look at these two kinds of proficiency. First, we have the technically oriented proficiency. You could also call this book knowledge. These are proficiencies with the technical aspects of the language, like grammar, vocabulary, lexicon, phonology. Technical proficiency allows a user to identify and correct mistakes in written or spoken language, okay? But as we said, this is only one of the two kinds of proficiency. To help you really grasp what technical proficiency means, I'd like to use a different example, an example that has nothing at all to do with language. Think about the Boeing 747 airplane for just a moment. If you had technical proficiency with the Boeing 747, that would mean that you might masterfully understand things like technical specifications for fuel, cargo weight limits, electrical systems, hydraulic systems, cockpit controls, all of these technical things. You have detailed knowledge of these things. But does that mean you can fly the airplane? I'm not sure that I would get in the airplane with you and trust you to fly it if you had just the technical proficiency, because the other kind of proficiency is action-oriented proficiency. So let's look at action-oriented proficiency next. This is the proficiency that describes what you can do or create or achieve with a language, in our case. Action-oriented proficiency is original and spontaneous. It's beyond memorization. So you need the technically oriented proficiency first in order to succeed with the action, but they are quite different. So here are some examples to help you better understand action-oriented proficiency. These are examples of how we might use English in the business world in an action-oriented proficiency. First, understanding changes to product specifications. So this requires you to not only understand what was in the past and what is in the present, but identify the difference and act on that difference. Another example of an action-oriented proficiency would be recording meeting minutes. So you would have to be able to listen to what is happening in the conversation around you, accurately record the most important points covered in that meeting, describe any action plans or specific problems to solve, record deadlines, and you have to do it all in a way that all of the other readers and attendees from that meeting could understand. Another example of action-oriented proficiency would be understanding spoken instructions. So understanding what someone says to you and then being able to act on what they tell you to do is another example of an action-oriented proficiency. And lastly, describing a process. So this requires not only knowledge of vocabulary and correct grammar and structure, but it also requires you to creatively use the language in a live and spontaneous way to describe how someone should do something, in what order. So as you can see, we have the two different kinds of proficiency, technically oriented and action-oriented. And when you talk about standardized testing, it's important to know how these things are measured in standardized tests. So in the past, most of the standardized tests focused very heavily or even exclusively on technically oriented proficiency. But we discovered that just because someone knows the rules doesn't mean they can fly the plane. So modern tests also focus on action-oriented proficiency as well. There are some elements of speaking and reading and writing and listening in modern standardized tests to simulate the activity that one would need to complete with English to simulate action-oriented proficiencies. So now that you understand that we have these two types of proficiency, let's move on and talk about proficiency described with proficiency frameworks. So why are proficiency frameworks relative or relevant to you in the corporate setting? Why should you care about them? You're not in academia studying linguistics, but they are important to you in the business world. And to answer why, the first thing I want to do is explain to you exactly what a proficiency framework is. So a proficiency framework is a widely accepted definition of proficiency levels. It's a foundation for describing proficiency in a very detailed way. It's not a test, it's just an extremely detailed description. Some of the things that a proficiency framework will give you are proof of proficiency using a standardized framework, portable achievement. Remember, we talked about being able to recognize and move achievement from one part of the globe to the other. Having that portability is extremely important in the modern workplace. And proficiency frameworks also establish a common reference for a description of proficiency. What I mean about this is that different tests can measure the same proficiency levels. So you could have multiple test creators developing entirely different tests, but if they're basing those tests on the same framework, then if you're looking at results from two of those different tests, you're comparing apples to apples. You're making a comparison of things that share a common reference. Now, if you look at tests that do not share a proficiency framework, then you're comparing apples to oranges because they're basing their descriptions of proficiency on entirely different frameworks. So that's really important for you to understand when you're thinking about selecting tests, especially if you're using multiple tests across the globe. So let's explore this a bit more. Let's talk about two very specific frameworks. We're going to discuss these two in detail in today's webinar. And the first one is called the CEFR, or the Common European Framework of Reference. This particular framework was developed by the Council of Europe. The other one we'll discuss is the ALTE, or Association of Language Testers in Europe. And this was developed by the Association of Language Testers. One of the founding members of this association was Cambridge English, and you may know this name because they're quite famous in the world of testing. So these two frameworks are especially popular among testers in Europe, and they were so widely accepted that other regions of the world began to recognize their value and the need to align tests to these particular frameworks. So today, most of the internationally recognized EFL tests link to one or both of these frameworks. Now, the next slide will illustrate for you in a very basic way how these frameworks work. It's a very detailed slide with a lot of text, so don't panic. I'll take you through it step by step. The first thing I want you to notice is on the far left, we have the levels for both of these proficiency frameworks. We have the CEFR level and the ALTE level. And the first thing that I want you to notice is that they are each divided into 6 levels of proficiency. Lowest level of proficiency is at the bottom, and the highest level at the top. Now, they each have different names for their levels of proficiency, but as you will see in just a moment, their descriptions for each level are quite similar. The other thing that I need you to understand about this slide is that this is just a tiny snapshot. These descriptions are in no way complete descriptions of a proficiency framework. The proficiency framework is a massive, massive document, and there's no way I could take you through the entire document in the limited time that we have together today. So my purpose in showing you this graph is to just give you a sense of the ascending level of proficiency described by a framework, and to also show you how these two particular frameworks are very, very similar. So let's begin at the bottom. We'll look at the CEFR level A1 to begin with. A user at this level of proficiency can understand and use familiar everyday expressions. And you can see that at this level of proficiency, the user has to deal with things of a very concrete nature. The ALTE describes this level as understanding basic instructions or taking part in a basic factual conversation on a predictable topic. So you see there's a very high level of predictability here. There's a lot of very basic vocabulary at this level. So it's A1 in the CEFR and it's ALTE in the ALTE framework. The next level, A2 in the CEFR, here users can communicate in simple and routine tasks requiring simple and direct exchange of information on familiar or routine matters. And in the ALTE, similarly, there's this description of expressing simple opinions or requirements in a familiar context. So again, you see at this level that familiarity is very important. A learner or a user at this level doesn't have a lot of ability to communicate outside of familiar topics. Moving up again, the CEFR level B1 user can produce simple connected text on topics that are familiar or of personal interest, and the ALTE2 says that a user here can express opinions on abstract and cultural matters in a limited way, or even offer advice if it's within a known area. A user here can also understand instructions or public announcements, according to the ALTE2. If we ascend again to the next level, the B2, in the CEFR, this user can interact with a degree of fluency and spontaneity that makes regular interaction with native speakers quite possible without strain for either party. So now you see that we're starting to introduce the idea of spontaneity in communication. And if we look at the ALTE3, that level is defined as a user who can follow or give a talk on a familiar topic, or keep up a conversation on a fairly wide range of topics. If we advance again to the CEFR C1, here you can see a user who can express himself or herself fluently and spontaneously without much obvious searching for expressions. This learner can also use language flexibly and effectively for social and academic and professional purposes. So we're starting to see a higher degree of flexibility with the language at this level. The ALTE describes this user as one who can contribute effectively to meetings and seminars within their own area of work, or keep up a casual conversation with a good degree of fluency, coping with abstract expressions. So once again here we have an element of spontaneity, because keeping up with a casual conversation requires you to be a bit spontaneous in your communication and to be able to deal with a wide range of topics. So let's go now to the very highest level of proficiency, the C2 level in the CEFR. Here, a user can express him or herself spontaneously, very fluently and precisely, and differentiate finer shades of meaning. And the ALTE5 user can advise on or talk about complex or sensitive issues, understand colloquial references, and deal confidently with hostile questions. So you can see this is the highest level of language achievement with the greatest degree of spontaneity and the greatest degree of skill in the English language. Now, remember that the reason these frameworks are important is in order to create portable achievement so that we can compare apples to apples and we can know that we're basing our measurement on a common framework of reference. Now, with that said, you could use 3 different tests all aligned to the same framework, but that does not mean that those 3 tests are equal. Okay, and we'll learn more about that in just a minute. What standardized test then might you want to choose for your language test needs? And that's a complex question as well. So I'll give you some tools to help you decide what test might be best in your situation. And by the way, these slides, including all of these graphs, will be available to you after the presentation. So here are some of the most common standardized tests in the world today for English. And I'd like to ask you another polling question at this point. I'd like to know which of these tests you use the most. Now, if you are just here because you're curious about testing and you don't use any of these tests, you don't have to submit this poll. If you teach English, choose the test that the majority of your learners are preparing for, that you're helping with. I see lots of responses coming through, so that's great. I'll give you just a moment more. Be sure to click the submit button after you've made your choice. All right. Let me share these results with you. So the majority of our audience today is using the TOEIC, which does not surprise me at all. The second most common is the BULATs, which again I find quite expected because these are 2 tests that were specifically designed for the business environment. But some of you are also using the TOEFL and the Cambridge English tests as well. So thank you for answering that poll question for me. That helps me to understand the composition of our audience a bit better and to know which tests you're working with regularly. Now, before you choose one of these standardized tests, it's really important for you to understand that tests have different scopes and purposes. So even if a test is aligned to a framework and 3 different tests are aligned to the same framework, those 3 tests can have different scopes and purposes. So let's talk about scope and purpose and how you can use that information when you're choosing tests. There are several questions you need to ask yourself about scope and purpose, and the first question is, what English-speaking environment is my test taker operating in? By this I mean, is my test taker operating in an academic environment, at a university perhaps? Is my test taker operating in a corporate environment, in a specific business using English? Or is my test taker operating in a general English environment? Say, for instance, someone who is immigrating to an English-speaking country. Tests are designed for each of these environments, and of course a test designed for academia will measure different vocabulary and different skills than a test designed for the corporate world. So that's the first important thing for you to understand. The next question to ask yourself is, what sorts of communicative tasks will my user, my test taker, need to master? And are some tasks more important than others? And by communicative tasks, I mean the basic 4: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So do you have a test taker who needs more emphasis on listening or speaking? Or do you have a test taker who needs more emphasis on reading and writing? Those are important things to consider before choosing a test, because different tests weight each of those skills differently and measure those skills differently. And lastly, you would want to ask yourself about the subject matter that your test taker needs expertise with. Is there any very specific subject matter that your test taker needs to master? For example, do they need mastery of legal vocabulary? That would have an impact as well on which test you decide to use. Now, we know that different tests have different scopes and purposes, and I've given you some general questions to ask yourself here. But let's take a look at those tests that I showed you a couple of slides ago, the ones that you answered the poll question about. And let's look at the scope and purpose of those specific tests. This table is going to give you an overview that will compare the scope and purpose of each of the major tests. And again, this table will be available to you after the presentation if you would like to refer to it in the future. Let's start with the TOEIC. So the TOEIC was a test specifically designed to measure English for the workplace and English for business communication. And this test is most often used for qualification for work and for admission to business-related academic programs. So there's a very strong corporate focus, business focus, with this particular test or measurement tool. The next one is the TOEFL, and this is a test that was designed specifically for use in testing English in academic settings. This test is most often used for admission to educational institutions and for immigration, although it can also be accepted by employers. Now, this test is not in the top list of tests that most of you are using. A smaller percentage of you are using the TOEFL. If you use this test, what's really important for you to understand is that it was designed for academia. So if you're using it as a measurement of someone's skill in business, the original focus of the test was academia, and you're using it as a measure for business. So even if someone looks extremely proficient in academia, that proficiency might not transfer exactly to the same level of proficiency in a business setting. The next test is the IELTS, and this one was designed to measure general and academic English. And by general English, I mean the type of language you would use if you immigrated to an English-speaking country. It's very broad, everyday language. This test comes in 2 formats for reading and writing, and it focuses on general training and academic. And most often, this test is used for admission to educational institutions and immigration, but sometimes it is also accepted by employers. Now, in our particular group today, we didn't have anyone respond that they're using this test, but occasionally an employer will use this test. And again, this is just important for you to know that this test was designed to measure general English proficiency and academic English proficiency. So if you're using it in the business context, it's just important for you to understand that was not the original design of this test, the business context. Next we have the BULATs, and this is another test that was specifically designed to measure English use in the workplace. This one is most often used for work qualification and admission to business-related programs. It's also used for assessment of training in the business setting. And I saw that quite a few of you were using the BULATs. That was the number 2 choice in our group of participants today. These next 3 tests, the BEC tests, are all created by Cambridge English. These were all designed for measuring English in the workplace, but what's unique about these tests is that they measure a very limited range of skill. So these are very often used for work qualification and admission to business-related programs, and we'll talk about these more extensively in just a moment. The FCE, the last test in our chart, was also created by Cambridge English, and it's also used for assessment of upper intermediate users of English, and it's very typically used for work qualification and admission to business-related programs. Just like the BEC tests, the FCE also measures a very limited range of skill, a very limited window of skill in English. So now you have this good overview of the scope and purpose of these tests, and there's one more really important thing to consider before you make your choice about which test to use. You don't want to throw away time and money using the wrong measurement tool. And some of these measurement tools, these tests, can only measure a specific limited range of the levels of proficiency. They don't cover the entire range. They can't measure all the way from bottom to top. So that's the next thing I'll show you. This next graph will show you on the far left the CEFR levels that we've already discussed, with the basic user A1 at the bottom. That's the lowest level of proficiency, and the most proficient user C2 at the top, the highest level of proficiency. And what we've done here is we've put each of the major tests we've been talking about today on this graph to show you the range of possible measurement of that particular tool. So the first one we'll look at is the TOEIC on the left. And right away you can see that the TOEIC covers almost the entire scale, almost the entire 6 levels of the CEFR proficiency framework. The only level that it doesn't cover is the highest level, C2. What does that really mean to you in practical terms? Well, it means that if a user takes this test and scores at the C1 level, you don't know if that learner is truly C1 or if that learner has an even higher level and could actually be a C2 level. So you cannot differentiate with this tool between C1 and C2. C1 is just the highest possible measurement you can get from this tool. The next test on this chart is the TOEFL, and I've broken that one down into 4 pieces because what's interesting about the TOEFL is that the different skills, speaking, writing, reading, and listening, each have a unique window of possible measurement. They're not all the same as they are with the other tests. So the speaking component of the TOEFL test is very similar to the TOEIC. It covers almost the entire range of the CEFR. The only thing that it doesn't cover is the highest level of proficiency. So again, you wouldn't be able to distinguish if your test taker is truly a C2 or a C1. The highest measurement you can get is C1. Now the writing component of the TOEFL is limited even a bit more because in the writing component you would not be able to accurately measure a learner at the A1 level, the most basic beginner, and you wouldn't be able to measure at the top of the scale either. You wouldn't be able to differentiate the C2 from the C1 learner. If we move on to the reading component of this exam, you see once again that it's further reduced, and this time on the reading component you cannot get an accurate measurement below level B1. So if you have someone whose level of skill is below that sort of intermediate independent user, the reading component of this exam will not give you an accurate measurement below B1. Now that might or might not be a problem. depending on how you want to use this test. If you're using this test simply to confirm that the test taker has B1 or above in their level of proficiency, this is a great test for you because you don't care about measuring at A1 or A2. But maybe if you were going to use this test to follow someone's progress as they were learning the English language, if they were an absolute beginner when they started and they made some progress, you would not be able to measure any progress at the A1 or A2 levels. You would only be able to begin measuring progress when they reached B1. Similarly, the listening component of this test is quite limited. You can see that it basically covers 3 levels of the proficiency framework. So again, you wouldn't get an accurate measurement at levels A1 or A2 or at level C2 at the top. So it's just important to understand your test taker, and it's also important to understand your need. Are you looking to measure progress for an absolute beginner, or are you looking to confirm an intermediate level of skill? And by answering those questions, you can choose the test that covers the right part of the framework. So keeping going, we're going to move on to the IELTS, and you can see that this one covers all levels except for the lowest 2 levels of proficiency. So once again, as long as you don't need a measurement at that lowest level, this test can be an excellent tool for B1 through C2 for the remaining levels. The BULATS is a test that covers the entire proficiency framework. Remember, this was also one that was designed specifically for the corporate setting. It's got a strong business focus. So if you need to follow the progress of a learner from absolute beginner all the way through the most proficient user, this particular test covers the entire proficiency framework and gives you a business focus. Now on the end, you'll see the BEC exams and the FCE exam, and those were the ones created by Cambridge English that we talked about previously. Do you remember how I told you that these exams had a very limited measurement window? Well, you can see that very clearly in this chart. So the BEC preliminary exam will cover only the B1 level of proficiency. So it's a great tool for confirming proficiency at a specific level. But if you wanted to track a learner's progress through multiple levels, this might not be the right measurement tool for you. And the same is true of the Vantage and the Higher and of the FCE. They're going to give you a snapshot of one specific level of proficiency, and they are not the right measurement tool if you want to see a range of proficiency across multiple levels, if you want to track that change in proficiency over time. So, in summary, this graph showing the different tests and what levels of what windows they can cover with their proficiency measurement, plus the previous graph that we looked at for scope and purpose. If you use those 2 tools together, you should be able to choose just the right exam for your particular measurement needs. And if you're helping a learner to prepare for an exam, these 2 tools can help you know where to focus the most of your time and energy so that you can achieve the best result with your learner. Now, we know that not all tests will exactly fit everyone's needs in every situation. So if you find yourself in a situation where a standardized test doesn't fully fulfill your needs, we'd like you to know that goFLUENT's testing approach is based on language competence specific to companies and their employees. And our testing approach is a good complement to any standardized testing that might not perfectly fit your needs. So I'd like to now just summarize with you the points that we covered in today's webinar. We'll talk about why proficiency frameworks are relevant to you in the corporate setting. We talked about the idea of portability of achievement and the idea of having a common reference for measurement so that you're comparing apples to apples. We also spoke about what English language tests aim to measure. Right? We learned about the difference between technically oriented proficiency and action-oriented proficiency. Then we discussed which English tests might meet your specific testing needs, and I showed you those 2 graphs, the one graph for scope and purpose, and the other graph to show you each test and what windows of measurement they cover. And lastly, we also spent some time talking about the effects of testing on recruitment and career development and evaluation. And we talked about the potential high cost of not testing effectively, because ineffective communication can be a result of not testing effectively. And that can lead to very high costs in your business in terms of lost revenue, or in terms of legal action or injuries to your staff and those other things that we discussed. So I'd like to now move on and open up the floor for your questions. If you'd like to submit a question, you can click on the red arrow on the right side of your screen and enter your question down the bottom in the chat box. I'm opening those questions now. Okay. All right, so one of the first questions was, are you going to share the slides with all of us? And we absolutely will. We'll make those available after the presentation today. We will also have an accompanying white paper on this topic of standardized testing and proficiency frameworks that we'll make available to you as well. Okay. Another question was, our employees need a particular standardized test score to be promoted? How can we help them achieve that test score? That's a great question, and your approach is going to depend on several things. First of all, it would depend on which type of test that they're taking. You'll need to know where your focus needs to be in terms of the skills. Does that particular test focus more strongly on reading and writing? What do the listening and speaking components of that test look like? What are the simulations like? So you can get as close as possible to those simulations in your study. And then also, you need to know what is the current level of your test taker and what are the gaps between your test taker's current level and where they're trying to move in the end, what goal they're trying to reach. So with that information, you can build a customized training path to really make sure that your test taker achieves the best score. Another question, what's the difference between the BEC Vantage and the FCE? So the FCE is one that is just marketed a bit differently by Cambridge English as an upper intermediate measurement. The BEC Vantage is kind of built into the package of three. The BEC Vantage, the BEC Preliminary, and the BEC Higher. And the FCE is quite similar, but it's a slightly different focus with a slightly broader perspective of language, whereas the BEC Vantage, which is at the equivalent level, is a slightly different focus because it's part of the 1 of 3 series of the BEC exams. Another question was, is the TOEIC more technically oriented or action oriented? That's a great question. Most tests today are more heavily weighted on the technically oriented side simply because from a test creation point of view, it's easier to write a technically oriented test. But modern tests strive very hard to create an action-oriented component that simulates the real work environment as best as possible. So the important thing to think about here is that any test is just a snapshot in time of that particular moment on that particular day. And they're not completely perfect measurement tools. There is no singular perfect measurement tool. If there were, I wouldn't have a webinar today. We wouldn't have any need to talk about choosing the right test. So any test is a snapshot of a moment in time, and a test score should be used in combination with other parts of your decision-making process and not just alone, all by itself. So yes, definitely consider the test score, but maybe also conduct an interview in English or talk to the colleagues of the candidate about their use in English so you have a sense of the real-world application, the action-oriented proficiency of that user in English. All right, and then the one last question, what's your test recommendation if the objective, oh, I'm sorry, more questions are coming and that one just disappeared on me. What's your test recommendation if the objective is to implement a program of English of classes in a business environment? So if you're really wanting to measure business English, I strongly recommend that you choose one of the tests that was designed for measurement of business English, and that was on the scope and purpose chart that we saw. One of the most common and most popular ones designed for business is the TOEIC. Another is the BULATs. But also consider what your purpose in measurement is. Are you looking to measure the progress of that learner over the whole entire course of their training? Do you need to be able to measure all the way from the lowest level of proficiency to the highest? Or are you looking to confirm proficiency at a certain level in the proficiency framework? So if you're just looking to confirm at one particular level, you don't need a test necessarily that can measure the entire range. But if you're wanting to measure progress from beginning to end of training, and you might have some learners that are low level, be sure to choose a test that can cover the entire range of proficiency. I think I have time for another. I have several more questions that have come in. Okay, so one of the questions was, how can you deal with staff who have different proficiency levels as a result of different testing standards? Participants may feel they are assigned a lower level due to change of standards. So this is where comparing apples to apples is so important. If you need to use 3 or 4 different tests, make sure that you choose tests that are aligned to the same proficiency framework, because then you're going to be comparing apples to apples. And you can take each of those tests and look at the proficiency framework equivalents so that you can tell the learner or the user took test number 1 how he compares to the other test taker that took test number 2 and how he compares to the test taker who took test number 3, because you have that common reference, that common proficiency framework. If you select tests that do not have a common proficiency framework, then you're in a much more difficult position, because it's much more difficult to show equivalence from one test to another when they're not based on the same framework. And by the way, all of the tests that we looked at today are based on the same proficiency frameworks. So you can compare apples to apples if you're using those particular tests. Okay. Another question was, how much time does it take a learner to move up from one level to another? And there is not a simple answer to that question. It depends on many, many different variables. It depends on the amount of practice the learner is receiving, the type of training the learner is receiving, the frequency of that training. There's no standard answer. I can't make a promise of advancement after a certain number of hours of training. There are just too many variables to consider. Training also advances more quickly when you're a low-level user, because you can advance quickly and increase your vocabulary and make a big dent in your language proficiency. And then as you reach the upper levels of proficiency, in order to increase your proficiency takes significantly more time. It's the learning curve. So as you gain in proficiency, it takes more effort and more time to continue to gain in proficiency. So unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that question. All right. Well, those seem to be all of the questions that we've received. I have just a couple of minutes more if anyone wants to slip in one last question before we finish. I'll watch for just a moment or two more. I appreciate very much your attention and your participation with the questions. They were very interesting questions. All right, well, as we're not receiving any more questions, I would like to just summarize by reminding you that we will have a white paper available for you. You will receive a copy of our white paper titled A Guide to English Tests and Proficiency Frameworks. You'll get that by email after today's presentation. And a recording of this webinar will also be available on the goFLUENT website. So again, I thank you very much for your time and attention. It was a pleasure being with you today.
Thank you again, Amy, for your expertise, and thank you everyone for joining us today. goFLUENT has a collection of white papers written by experts in the field of training and our own resources team. You will see on your screen just a few of these white papers, such as a guide for developing a request for proposal for language training services, the ROI of training, strategies and evaluation methods, from blended learning to integrated learning, and how to implement mobile learning in global organizations. Please feel free to visit our website to download any of these white papers. As Amy mentioned, we will send you the link to download the presentation and to watch the recorded video of this webinar, and we will also send you our white paper on English tests and proficiency frameworks. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you again at our future events. Thank you and have a great day.